So first of all, I'm going to say that we have a, don't know if there's going to be a technical hitch. We've done a bit of a workaround using Keynote and because I'm visually impaired and I can't actually see what's going on here, what I've done, which I think is quite clever, is we've put an MP3 file into each slide, which reads into my Bluetooth. So as I change, I know what's going on. So I thought we were quite happy. Thought that was quite cool use of technology. So today I'm going to be talking about web accessibility for happy designers, and so I know that there are probably going to be some cynics in the audience who are thinking, okay, accessibility, disability, blah, blah, blah. I'm a designer. I want to make things pretty. What's accessibility to do with me? And I also know that disability and accessibility, and particularly visual impairment, has certainly been intrinsically linked and probably linked to ugly websites. And so a lot of people think that accessibility is something that they need to do out of obligation. So what I'd like to do today, my aim of my presentation, is to get people feeling happy and comfortable with accessibility and leaving wanting to embrace it. No, that's the wrong way, sorry. It seems that, particularly because of my visual impairment, I tend to spend a lot of time debunking myths. And the way I seem to go about doing that is by stating the obvious, interjecting a bit of humor. So this technique seems to work for me. I think that's how I'm going to move on. So here I go. I am always quite amazed when a lot of people who feel surprised when they're using a CMS or another database-driven system when it doesn't spit out accessible or usable code to the front end, or where its core features and functionality don't work in an accessible way straight out of the box. It's virtually impossible to build a CMS that takes into consideration all different users' needs, the technologies they're using, how technology changes, and so on. But I do think that using CMSs and systems that are already pre-built or pre-configured are fantastic, because you really don't want to be reinventing the wheel. But what's really important is that you understand the way that you use these systems is as such that you have accessibility in mind. Now, using what I call are sort of the more onerous content management systems, the ones that have all the bells and whistles and are completely have a total infrastructure where they're quite robust, but they're also have a lot of integral stuff that isn't accessible. If you use one of those systems, what you end up doing is picking it apart and having to rebuild it, and I don't really see the point in that. So what we tend to use, what I really like at the moment, and there's quite a few coming out, are content management frameworks. Not the Cake PHP type, something a bit more advanced than that. We, at the moment, are working with a technology called Silverstripe. And we were really liking the framework because it has a base framework. You can build accessibility into the core, into the base, into the foundation, and then it gives you a lot of flexibility with being able to hang code and being able to make your code really standard compliant, really clean, as well as manipulating the actual features to make them accessible. So we really like those content management frameworks because we really think that that is the best way, because you can take something that's already existing, which obviously is a great starting point, and then make the website what you want it to be. And what I think particularly about Silverstripe that's really interesting is we're now talking to them quite seriously about being involved in making their system more accessible. So they're taking accessibility very seriously, and I'm hoping to be able to work with them on the future iterations of their system to make sure that what it does in the core is more accessible. So maybe I will be eventually saying accessibility does come in a box at some point, I hope. So watch this space. Okay, why do I keep pointing at that when I should be pointing here? Okay. Okay, so less is not more is my idea of saying that a lot of people seem to think that for disabled users, if you just give them a text version of your website or you strip it down, then that's going to be good. As long as it's accessible, that means it's acceptable. Well, I think if you think that, you're going down a very slippery slope, because accessible and boring are not synonymous, and creating great and beautiful accessible websites is creating websites for everyone. If you create websites where you limit the functionality and the features, then you're not creating an accessible website. So less is definitely not more. I know that for those of you who are working in businesses where your boss tells you, just give them what they want, your client always knows best. Well, I'm here to say that when it comes to accessibility, the client definitely doesn't know best. Most clients probably don't know anything about accessibility, and I think it's really our responsibility as website creators to educate them. And although in law and things like DDA, yes, it's their responsibility to conform, but I also think that if they don't know about it, and we do, it's our industry that needs to move this forward and needs to educate them. And there are also some clients that do know about accessibility. And we have some clients that know, that kind of understand what they need, and they talk a bit about alt text, or they talk about error handling maybe, and they have an idea. But because of most of the documentation out there about accessibility, particularly the WCAG, is just real technical jargon, very heavy going. And so you kind of understand why they're not in the know. So what I really think is that you just need to be able to guide your clients, to encourage them particularly to engage with users at the earliest stage of the project, because at the end of the day, the real accessibility experts are the people actually using the websites. I think that a lot of people think that building an accessible website is something that you have to do for disabled people who don't actually care about what a website is designed like. Well, for me, for example, although I'm visually impaired, I still have sight, and I actually come from a fine arts background, which I know is ironic, but I actually do care about what things look like. I can still see. I might not see some of the, I might not do things like that. I might not see some of the finer detail, but I do care about creating great experiences for everyone. So if you're thinking that, okay, I need to build an accessible website for disabled people, well, in the UK, there's 18% of the population is disabled. So if you build it just for them, then you exclude the other 82% of the population, and that doesn't make sense. So creating accessible websites is about creating accessible websites for everybody, and so that they're beautiful and usable for everyone. And if you think that you're creating a website for a specific disability and it's accessible for that group, that disabled group, and it excludes other people, it isn't an accessible website. This is definitely, as far as we are concerned, the Mecca. And I call it inclusivity, because beauty, usability, and accessibility should all be together. When you build a great website, these things are the things that should be standard. You should be thinking about all of these things all the time. But I do hear a lot of whinges from the designer camp saying, well, if I build an accessible website, it's going to hamper my creativity. And we also hear news from the developer camp where people are saying, oh, well, you know, it's going to limit the functionality, it's going to restrict what I can do. Well, accessible websites are intrinsically supposed to be usable, but they actually don't need to be beautiful, which I just think is really ridiculous. And so would my friend Frank Lloyd Wright. Sorry, for those of you who don't know, I absolutely love Frank Lloyd Wright. He's the guru of inclusive design as far as I'm concerned, so I got a nice picture of him there. But what's really important is making sure that you get the right balance between form and function, because that is what great design is all about. Well, a lot of people ask me, so how much more is it going to cost me for my accessible website? And my answer is always the same: nothing. Because when you're talking about designing great websites, accessibility is just part of it. I'm sure that there are what I call the 99-pound merchants, you know, the cowboys as in any industry, people who are going to offer you a website for 99 pounds with 5,000 emails, a bit of hosting, and the chance to win a cruise to the Caribbean for 2. But those really aren't the kind of websites we're talking about. So for the purposes of today, I'm assuming that we're talking about quality websites for quality clients, and in that camp, accessibility is firmly fixed. So for the companies, like agencies, who are developing websites, there should be a cost in in learning about accessibility. But that cost shouldn't be prohibitive, because one would assume that most organizations have some training, knowledge, and so on. And so this is just part of it. It's just part of staff development. Now, if you work for a company that doesn't provide training and your finance department are still using an abacus, you could be in trouble. But for most people who are in this industry, you should be committed to learning and moving forward, because technology moves fast. I certainly think that it's fantastic to start with the foundation of standard compliant HTML and CSS, but it really is only the beginning. And I know that it's a really great feeling when you WAS your code through the W3C validator and it passes, but that doesn't mean that your site is accessible. I know plenty of websites that actually don't pass validation, but in my mind are still accessible. For example, if you're going to use CSS3 because you think, you know, this is actually a much better solution for my client and it's cross-browser compatible, cross-user agent compatible, then I say go for it, use it. It may not parse, but it's actually a better solution. So that, to me, is perfectly acceptable. However, if you have a client who feels that level of comfort with validating your code is what really matters, then ultimately I think the website could potentially suffer, but as parsing is part of conformance to the WCAG, then if you're going to go the conservative route, that's how you're going to have to go. I've heard so many times people refer to accessibility as an add-on or a feature, and I'm pretty certain that I start to wince. I think that when I hear of accessibility being referred to as a tool, I start to hyperventilate. But then when I hear of accessibility being added to a checklist that somebody thinks that they need to get done before the guests come around for dinner, I think I pretty much probably pass out. Accessibility is a completely integral part of a website. It's something that needs to be built into the foundation and needs to be considered from the outset. Websites are about people, are about end users, and so if you're not thinking about the people that are using your website and building accessibility in from day one, then you're not, I don't know who you're building your website for, because it's not for technology. People use websites, technology doesn't use technology. Having client-side software or programming to make your website work is just not a good way to go. If you want to have use JavaScript as an enhancement, I think that's great, or other software as enhancement, I think that's fantastic. But for people who have perhaps JavaScript turned off or images turned off, the experience for them needs to be of equal value. They need to be able to have all of the core features and functionality that anybody else has available to them. And so there should be no limitations or no restrictions on what they can do. So what's really important is making sure that the base foundation is absolutely pure, robust HTML. If you then want to add layers on, obviously CSS and JavaScript and so on, if you want to add those layers on so that you can give a better user experience or greater choice without impacting on the core functionality, then I think that's absolutely the way to go. But you need to make sure that you can rely on the tools you have that you can actually control. A lot of people think that accessibility is all or nothing, that a website is either accessible or inaccessible. Well, that just isn't the case, because the WCAG are guidelines. And those guidelines aren't laws, and they're guidelines for a reason, because there are so many variables hovering around why a website is or isn't some bit more accessible. You have to consider your client's needs, you have to consider costs, budget, resources, socioeconomic factors, language factors, access to technology, and so on. And so it really needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis in terms of what resources are available and how accessible a website can be made. What this isn't is an excuse to eschew accessibility, to say, oh, well, yeah, I can't do it. If you have the resources available to you, whether that's people or budget or knowledge or whatever it is, you have to use those resources. It's imperative that you do so. But on the other side of it, what I don't want to see is having a website that is perhaps a website that's been built by a community on a voluntary basis that serve a particular community and give them a service that they require. And the website hasn't been built using the best technology, they didn't have any money, but it offers a really good service to that community. I would rather that website be there and be able to offer that service than not be there at all. So you really have to think that there is no holy grail. It is a movable feast, and you need to think and use the tools that you have to hand and stretch them as much as you can. Most mistakes that people make when it comes to accessibility are pretty simple, and they're simply because people don't think about people. What you need to do, the minute you start to even consider your website, the minute you get your client brief, the minute you start to think about building your website, you need to think about the actual people that are going to use it. You need to close your eyes, and you need to think about all the weird and wonderful people accessing the internet, whether they're doing it in their underpants or whatever on earth they're doing. You just need to think about all the wide and varied people that use the internet. And if you do that, you'll probably not make a lot of the common mistakes that I'm going to talk about now. Yeah, I always laughed about luminosity ratio. It just seems to me such a fancy word for color contrast. But I always laugh about luminosity. Don't know why. I think that word is just incredibly funny. But luminosity ratio really is just making sure the color contrast is appropriate so that people can actually read the key content on the website. But it isn't always necessary in certain instances. So if you want to use color, you want to use shading, you want to use some floating backgrounds or anything like that, and it doesn't affect the user experience and it doesn't affect the core content, then you should go for it. But if you decide that you want to highlight a certain content area by use of color and it adversely impacts on the color contrast of the actual content, then that's an issue. So really it's just a matter of thinking about how you use color and making sure that the core content and features aren't impacted, so just keep your luminosity in check. Media loading when your page loads is totally irritating, and I don't think anybody should do it. But if you do want to start your AV extravaganza, then you should basically ask people first. If you have a lot of AV content, using some really good tools like JW Player and the Dojo Toolkit will keep you in really good stead. Sometimes, particularly for AT users, websites can be wild goose chases because for some reason a lot of website owners seem to think that if you have a lot of things to click on your website, it's really good. Well, what actually happens if you have too many things to click on, or they're not relevant, or you don't know where things are going, it actually makes for a worse user experience. So when you think about links, you need to think quite carefully. You need to think why. You need to think, what's the purpose of this link? Where is the link going? How's it affecting the user experience? What happens, and that can be incredibly irritating, is when links either take you to places that you don't want to go, do things that you don't want to do, or just downright lie to you. And as far as I'm concerned, any of these websites need to be arrested and put in jail for cyber cruelty. What really matters is making sure that you think about where you're taking people, where they're going, why they're going there. And when you think about links, internal or external, you have to think about the user journey. Yeah, well, if I had a dime for every bit of alt text that was either irrelevant or illogical, well, but alt text is there for a purpose. It has meaning, and it isn't something you just throw in, so don't be lazy about it. Lady is not alt text, it's just a word out of context. And if your images are just decorative, then leave it out. I don't know any screen reader user that wants to be told about things that are irrelevant to them. Well, really glad access keys are gone now, but access keys, in theory, were a really good idea because it gave you sort of key points and ways to navigate around a website. The problem was they were never standardized, and they ended up conflicting with other keyboard commands. So they are now firmly redundant. They have been replaced by the far superior bypass block, which allows people to navigate around websites by identifying key areas of content. Now, I do know that YARIA and HTML5 are certainly going to take what now is the humble bypass block and make it the star of the internet, but as we stand now, using bypass blocks is a really good way to help users navigate around key content and make sure that they're able to navigate the website and become familiar with what's happening on different pages. So bypass blocks are, to me, I think they're the most fantastic thing since sliced bread, because it just helps people get around websites and know where they are and have that familiarity, particularly for A2 users. Well, I sometimes find it incredible about how how so many websites don't have a lot of attention paid to their navigational structure. There's so many websites where the navigational structure is illogical or is just all over the place, where you have headings that are missing or headings that aren't nested properly, and that just makes things really confusing. It's really important to think about the whole user journey when you think about your navigation, and having a well-structured and robust navigation is the foundation for having a really great website. Well, forms, and more forms. Forms, and as it happens, we have a website launching tomorrow where forms, I believe, have possibly been the theme of the entire project, because forms are incredibly difficult. Forms also are really important because we interact with people on the website. We want to get information about them. We want them to be able to give information to us. So using forms is really important. But getting it right is one of the most difficult things to do as far as accessibility is concerned. And I think I'm probably going to stick my neck out here because I don't actually believe right now in the technology that we're using that there is one single solution. And I think all I do is I keep on saying in the back of my mind, roll on HTML5, roll on HTML5, because I know there's some really elegant solutions on the horizon. But for now, we need to use the technologies that we have, which isn't always ideal, and I always say, damn you, IE6, and we need to be able to pay attention to forms in a rather anal and detailed way. I probably could talk about forms for another 6 hours, but I think that you guys would fall asleep. So I'll try to give you what I think are some of the highlights. I think what's really important is how you handle people as they navigate through your forms. And again, particularly people with assistive technology or English isn't a first language, so it needs to be simple and needs to be intuitive. The one thing, particularly for screen reader users and keyboard users, is focus. Losing focus in a form is enough to drive anybody crazy, and certainly enough to drive the most calm and collected person and turn them into Tasmanian devils. So it's not such a good idea. But using forms and making sure that people can navigate through them and they're easy to use is really important. The other thing about forms is when you are helping people navigate through them, please, please, please don't use erroneous or ununderstandable labels or information. And if you put labels or information in to help users, please don't put it in after the field box. Don't put in pop-up menus or tooltips that people can't access or can't read after they've already been trying to fill things in. So it's thinking about the user and thinking about where things are placed, how they're placed, using language, using copy properly, using labels properly, and making the experience logical. And if users are going to make errors, because they do, you need to make sure that you guide them and help them correct them. When, when I make an error and there's an asterisk that comes up that I can't see and spend 10 minutes looking for, it's very irritating. I don't think that's just VI people. I think that happens to a lot of people. And if said asterisk occurs after the form you need to fill in, I think that most assistive technology users, if they do find it, when they do find it, will be definitely cursing you because they're going to have to go back to fix it. So it's really thinking about the journey semantically, but also thinking about where things occur, and actually just thinking about it as a process, as a flow. The things that happen to you visually, you need to think about how it actually happens within the technology. And if you're using JavaScript or Ajax and your page refreshes when you hit submit, you just have to tell people that that's what you're doing. I don't think I know anyone, or if there's anyone here, please tell me, and I'll laugh at you, that thinks CAPTCHA is okay. CAPTCHA is just the most irritating thing in the universe. So I prefer SAPTCHA because it's very simple, and although it sounds similar, it is in no way related. And for those of you who don't know what SAPTCHA is just using a text question saying like, what day comes after Sunday, or what color is the sky, or very simple questions that people can type in and answer, and that's it. It's far superior to CAPTCHA. I realize that any of these things can be irritating, but if you use forms and you need to control spam, I'd say SAPTCHA is far superior. Well, when you're developing your form, you know that you're trying to get a lot of data off users, and your client wants to know everything, everything about them. And I think that's great, but you also need to think about the user experience themselves, because forms that have too much information or things that aren't relevant or aren't really appropriate to the user or actually don't serve the purpose for which the form is, and they're serving some other marketing purpose, that can lead to abandonment or the person falling asleep while they're trying to fill in your form. So you really just need to be thinking about what you need. You should ask your dog, your mum, your cousin, anybody who will be able to be able to tell you, but make your forms lean and mean. Well, that's me. I guess in conclusion, what I'd have to say is that building accessible websites is pretty simple. It requires a bit of knowledge and a whole hunk of common sense. But building beautiful and accessible websites takes skill and talent, and that's over to you guys.